joining me again. It's good to see you. The government restrictions that are slowly being lifted, making it easier for people to get about, those new regulations don't actually apply to the church. At this stage, it'll be some time before we can meet together. So I'm going to continue with these and see at what point we get to. We are currently in Ephesians chapter 2, and last week we ended with chapter 2, verse 13, which speaks about Jesus being our peace. Now let's read on from there. Sorry, that was verse 14. He himself is our peace, and he has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by abolishing in his flesh the law with its commandments and regulation. His purpose was that to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace, and in this one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death the hostility. That's a long sentence where by now you'll be familiar with Paul writing long stuff like that. But he's talking about human hostility to start off with, and we have plenty of examples. Don't have to look far, do we, to see that? And you wonder, well, what on earth can be done about it? Well, some people would say, well, actually what we need is some sort of educational input. People need to be taught. It's intellectual, the problems. If you teach them, the problems will resolve. Others will say, well, it's surely governmental. We need to legislate so that people aren't able to do the things they do that are wrong, or rather directed towards the good. Now, we know those things will have some impact. Some people, of course, say, actually, you don't need those things, you just need revolution. We need to change it violently. Of course, that usually creates more problems than it solves. Well, Paul's answer, however, is that we need some sort of spiritual redemption, because actually it's the human heart and our relationship with God that that makes these things so powerful. And that's where we need to deal with it. And so that's what Paul's talking about in verse 14. When he talks about Jesus Christ destroying the dividing wall. Let me read it again. He has made the two one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility. In his case, there was an actual dividing wall. It was in the temple, and anybody could go in, but only to a certain point. At one point, there was a notice that read basically to say that any Gentile that stepped beyond that was at risk of being put to death. So there was a physical barrier in the temple that stopped Gentiles from accessing God. Now that barrier was physically destroyed in AD 70 when the Romans sacked Jerusalem, burned the temple down, and made off with all the temple treasures. But Paul is talking about a dividing wall of hostility being removed earlier, in about AD 30, when he talks about Jesus on the cross. And so he destroyed that. And what Paul is saying is that it's Jesus who removes these barriers. And he has three things to say about how Jesus does that. Firstly, he says, verse 15, that Jesus abolished the law with its commandments and regulations. He's talking about the Jewish law that he grew up under, which for Jews was sacrosanct. It had to be kept, and it divided them from everybody else who didn't have it. But however, Jesus fulfilled everything the law spoke of, like the sacrifices, for instance. They spoke about a sacrificial victim being offered for sins. Well, Jesus offered himself, but just as one sacrifice, taking away all sin, and so therefore it was no longer needed. And therefore the law is something that's no longer necessary to bring us to God, no longer necessary for us. And therefore it brings people together. People can come together. Second thing it says that Jesus does is that he creates a new humanity in himself. And you do actually see this in action in multinational churches. He brings people together. In him, there should be no barrier between those of different race or different backgrounds, different national groupings. He draws them together. And you do see that where it should be in churches. And in that one group of people brought together, he brings them together to God. He reconciles this new humanity to God through his death. There is a question when it talks about it says he puts to death in verse 16, he puts to death the hostility. And whose hostility is it? Well, it could be ours against each other. That's what the passage has mentioned. It could be ours against God. That exists, but I don't think he's talking about it here. More likely, it's just talking about God's hostility towards our sins. That is dealt with completely by the death of Jesus on the cross. He puts that to death as well, and therefore makes it possible for us to be at peace with him. So Paul's answer is it's spiritual redemption. Those things that divide us are removed by Jesus when we come to him. We are reconciled to God and to each other. And those problems that divide us are dealt with at the foot of the cross when we are reconciled to God and to one another. Other factors, of course, may play a part. They may play a local short-term influence. It was interesting that when this coronavirus crisis started, people were saying, we're all in this together. And to a degree we were, but actually now we're discovering we're not so together as we thought we were. Certain groups are more affected by the virus. Certain groups are more exposed to it. Economic impact is going to be different for lots of people. And that unity is breaking down. We need something bigger than localized short-term factors. Paul says we need Jesus to end the hostility because that's what he's done. He's brought an end to that hostility. And Paul says only Jesus is big enough for that task. We'll see a bit more tomorrow.